Retrak to be considered a famous Ukrainian prince who fought at the time against Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, during the Great Northern War. It should be quite prescient to those looking at comparisons with what's happening today that Ivan Mazeppa's rebellion was sponsored and supported by one famous king of the West, King Charles XII, Carolus Rex. Indeed, if you look at the fate of Poltava, the examples of trying to dismember Russia by tearing apart her vassals, it's eerie. Indeed, it's a comment I've made on other streams regarding the policy of Carolus Rex, King of Sweden, as an early example of regime change in Russia, or an attempted and ultimately futile ascent. But there's another element to here, which is Mazeppa being invited as the Cossacks' guest to become king, the man who would be king, the man who would try to tame this wild realm of the wild fields of Zaporozhye, the borderlands, the Ukraina, the land between the other realms, try to carve out his own kingdom, and indeed do so with the support of Western leaders, in particular the King of Sweden. All of this should be obvious in terms of a comparison for people listening, but there's another point to mention, which is again the futility of the rage refining on my pain, striving as a vain fool to establish a kingdom. It's the idea almost of an oxymoron of that of a Ukrainian kingdom having ever existed, or the potentiality for it ever to exist. And against this, I want to, I would say, regale a fantasy to you, which is a fantasy of what Ukraine ought to be. If we look at the etymological and historical roots of Ukraine, if we really focus on this idea of a borderland, on the potentiality of Ukraine in the post-Soviet settlement when it ceased to become a Soviet republic. The whole notion of a borderland, in the case of today, the borderlands between the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and Russia, it lends itself to a federal structure. Ukraine is an amalgamation of cultures and of peoples, from the Rusins and the Hungarians in the west to the Russians in the east, to the hodgepodge of nationalities that you see in Bessarabia. Indeed, if you also include the Polish-influenced areas and the Austrian-influenced areas in the west versus the more Russified areas in the east, and indeed the lingering elements of Turkish and Cossack influence, which was more poignant when you included Crimea as formerly part of Ukraine until it was annexed by Russia in 2014. This whole notion that Ukraine is really a nation between nations and in itself an anti-nation, it is a space, it is the Pontic steppe, it is the void. It lends itself to this idea, like I said, of a federal structure, all of these elements being included and represented. This is also referenced in terms of the very religious makeup of Ukraine. Ukraine, on the one hand, is a bastion of orthodoxy. Indeed, from my point of view, it's clear to see that the development of Russian orthodoxy, especially if we look at the old believers and Alexis in the 17th century, again, this is going to sound completely out there for most people listening who are only familiar with what counts as commentary on Ukrainian history, that Kiev has influenced Moscow and vice versa, that there is a bit of to and fro regarding the makeup of the whole Orthodox community, the Eastern Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is all the more tragic when you look at the recent schism. But then against that, you also have the influence of the Uniate Church, the Slavonic Rite Catholics, and indeed of Latin Rite Catholics themselves. All of these commingling influences, again, they are a demonstration, or were at least, the fact that history of Ukraine is an oxymoron if one looks at it as a nation-centered history. It is the diversity of all of these different influences commingling together into a new construct for a nation state. What is the closest then that we have towards a whole idea of peace for this? The ironic thing is, it was actually sponsored by Russia in the Eternal Peace of 1686, which I would comment as one of the great triumphs of European diplomacy, and it was orchestrated under a figure which most people have now forgotten because she forms part of the backstory of Tsar Peter the Great, who has overshadowed her legacy, which was the great sovereign Sophia, his elder half-sister. But nevertheless, the Eternal Peace was able to rectify, you can say, centuries of horrific animosity between the Poles and the Russians. The Poles, just for example, had been fighting a war with Russia on and off since the height of Ivan the Great and the Livonian Wars. They had occupied Moscow. The Romanov dynasty had been forged in opposition to that following the liberation of Moscow in, what was it, the year 1613. Of course, 200 years later, we have the example of the Great Patriotic War to come as a further comparison to that. But the remarkable thing about this Eternal Peace Treaty is that you have these two hostile elements who are both ethnically, religiously, and culturally completely opposed to one another. And yet they are able to form some iteration of a peace which lasts until the partitions of Poland, the very cynical partitions of Poland from 1772 onwards, up until the dissolution of Poland as a state in 1795. If there is a peace between two such opposed elements, it was demonstrated in 1686. Of course, this wasn't demonstrated in terms of the creation of a Ukrainian identity. What Ukraine was separated between these two peaceful entities. When we talk about the left bank and the right bank Ukraine, the areas under Russian occupation, the areas in which the Cossacks had basically sworn allegiance following the Treaty of Pereyaslav, or indeed, according to some interpretations of that treaty, where the Russians under Tsar Alexis had decided essentially to recognize the idea of a primordial, or you can say embryonic Ukrainian state in the form of the Cossack hetmanate of Khmelnytsky, which again contrasts the idea of Ivan Mazepa, which I brought earlier. All of this is to say that all of these elements, like I said, commingling together this idea of peace in Ukraine, it is held again to this idea that Ukraine is one of the most heterogeneous states in Europe. Indeed, you can almost say the world. What defines Ukraine in contrast to so many of the other states in Europe is its heterogeneity, the fact that its borders are, as a result of great power contrivance, not to say that's not the case of every border in terms of European nations, but in the case of Ukraine, no one is really satisfied with its borders. If you're a Ukrainian nationalist, it's not simply a matter of not tolerating truncation of your territory, but you want to expand Ukraine up to the natural boundaries of the Don, or perhaps even further to the River Volga or the Caucasus. And of course, if you're a Russian nationalist, as we're seeing, trying to sunder the four oblasts from the remnants of Ukrainian territory, having already taken Crimea. So that is one element here, which I bring essentially to the idea, the dream of what is represented by Ukraine. And in terms of what that could really represent in a post-Soviet settlement during the unipolar moment, is it could have acted as a bridge, not just a borderland, but a gateway from which to integrate the cultures of Russia and the cultures of Europe. Essentially, Ukraine would be a conduit for what represents the best of those civilizational elements and could form as a way essentially of bridging the two identities through a Ukrainian federal identity. But moving on from the dream and to the reality, that was not the way Ukraine was construed by certain policymakers in the West. Ukraine has instead been construed as an icebreaker against Russian nationality. If you look at the whole Soviet historiography of Ukraine, trying to justify Ukrainian membership of the Soviet Union, with its borders having essentially been established by Lenin in 1922 following the civil war against the Whites, the whole notion of Ukrainian identity was vested in this idea that there was a pan-Slavic element which was recurring throughout East Slavic history. And again, if you're going to compare this to somewhere like Croatia, rather ironically, a huge amount of intellectual development in the 19th century focuses on the unity between the peoples of Ukraine and the peoples of Russia, what were then termed the Little Russians and the Greater Russians, this whole notion of pan-Slavism. While pan-Slavism was actually such a threat to the Russian Tsar, is that there was a democratic basis to it, which instead was found in the Ukrainian fetishization of the life of the Cossack. There was a democratic identity to be wedded here. And again, this is to emphasize that there is a large strain of Ukrainian national thought, which is wedded instead to this idea of pan-Slavism, to be wedded to be part of this greater whole. In a sense, you can say that this Ukraine would follow in the impetus of the French Revolution, that is a matter essentially of forming a democratic state from these elements within the Russian Empire. And indeed, conversely, it was also used by Tsar Nicholas II as a justification for Little Russian expansion at the expense of the Austrian Empire. So it's rather ironic that I take this element of the intellectual development of Pan-Slavism within Ukraine, which again is another element which Putin, and like I said, the Soviet historiography essentially explains as representing this historic fraternity between the nations. Little Ukraine, or Little Russia or Ukraine, is effectively supposed to represent the eldest brother to Russia. It essentially is the second member of this great pursuit of socialism in one country. So against that, against, you can say, the hagiography, which alludes to certain influences towards Russia, that Ukraine is inevitably part of the Russian patrimony and not part of the Western patrimony, which I've just outlined there. We have the view placed in contradistinction to that, which is Ukraine as the national icebreaker. If you look at the intellectual indebtedness of Pan-Slavism and you look at Ukraine, if you can somehow take Ukrainian nationality and you can sunder it completely from Russian nationality, then all of a sudden you have created the impetus for the dismemberment of Russian nationality in total. If Ukraine can be placed as a diametric opposite, as an antithesis of the existence of Russia, what Putin would consider to be his own perception of Nazification in the case of Ukraine, then it only follows that Russian nationality is incredibly precarious. And that, I believe, is part of the tragedy of Ukraine in this instance. I talk about the federal structure. I talk about Russia trying to reintegrate this notion of Ukrainian nationality through the veins of Pan-Slavism, and indeed you can say the more anti-ethno-nationalist affiliations with Soviet communism, which again Putin is very much a successor to. And then you have this idea of Ukraine as the icebreaker. Ironically, regarding how much Putin talks about Nazification, the Germans during World War II weren't really prepared to exploit the extent to which that principle of Ukrainian identity and nationality, used in contrast to a pan-Slavic Russian identity or Russo-dominated identity, could be used to dismember Russian nationality. So while you have the lionization of figures such as Stepan Bandera among certain facets of the Maidan movement, it's very clear that he was a marginalized figure within World War II. So again, the subtle contrast between these opinions. But my general point is Ukraine, in this sense, you can almost say is analogous to Croatia and Yugoslavia. I do believe there's an argument to be presented that Croatia was essentially used as the cudgel, as the icebreaker, from which members of the European Union and indeed the West were able to dismantle Yugoslavism. And that is very much happening in the case of Ukraine today and Pan-Slavism. Indeed, there's another point which can be drawn here, which again, the subtle ironies to the socialist government of Slobodan Milosevic looking at the checkerboard flag of Franjo Tuchman and saying that this was a restitution of the Ustasha of fascism, in the same way that Putin looks at the Azov battalion and sees this as the restoration of the Banderites of Nazism. It's really rather remarkable to consider all of these sort of subtle permutations and influences. But like I said, I think there's an element here that despite, again, Ukraine having been in many senses the originator of intellectual Pan-Slavism, as Croatia was in many ways the originator of intellectual Yugoslavism, that both of these nations should be held as some form of World War II analogous Nazi iteration to break both of these nations. But regardless, moving on from that, the effect of the war, regardless of whatever identity is being forced upon Ukraine, whether it be this Russophobic identity or this Russophilic identity, it should go without saying that Ukrainian identity, I would say, is undergoing a process of becoming a nation once again. That's a famous quote from Churchill regarding Ireland's potential participation in World War II. And what I believe Churchill is alluding to, even though Irish nationalists take it to mean something completely different, is that a nation once again alludes to what I believe to be the Australian experience in Gallipoli, which is that a nation is forged in the fires of conflict. In the case of the experience of Gallipoli for the Anzac nations, the military disaster was actually enough to form such a state of national consciousness that actually created a set of separation from the motherland, a separation from Britain, owing to the fact you can say that Churchill's doomed enterprise there had in many ways expended the forces of the Commonwealth in a futile endeavour. You can say actually that again is rather prescient if we understand Ukrainian identity as looking at the example of some form of 21st century Gallipoli, which ultimately is what it amounts to, a glorious idea of taking Constantinople or taking Moscow, which ends up to be a total military farce. So regardless of how the war turns out, regardless of how well Russia may be doing on the battlefield, I believe it's undeniable that if there was a Russophilic aspect to Ukrainian identity, the whole nature of war and the whole nature of these nations felling each other in the tens of thousands has inevitably led to, I would say, an irrevocable breach in identity.